Under the pale moon, a poor rancher spotted two wounded women collapse in the dust outside his home. He lifted them in his arms, sheltered them, fed them, and fought through the night to keep them alive. When sunrise painted the prairie gold, the sound of hundreds of footsteps echoed across his land. The tribe had come, not in anger, not in suspicion, but with tear-filled eyes, forming a line that stretched across the valley to honor the man who saved their daughters. The horizon shivered under the first pale light of morning, a trembling promise swallowed by the dark belly of storm clouds. Thunder growled like an ancient beast, rolling across the barren expanse of the ranch, shaking the skeletal trees that clung stubbornly to the soggy soil. Rain fell in jagged sheets, slicing through the cold, gusting wind, soaking every worn boot and tattered coat. Mud sucked at the soles of the lone rancher's boots as he battled across the slicked fields, each step a fight against the storm's fury. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the jagged outline of his weathered face. Eyes narrowed, jaw set, hands raw from the cold and effort. His breaths came sharp and ragged, mingling with the roar of wind and the slap of rain on the wooden barn. He had seen storms before, but this one carried a weight heavier than mere weather, a pulse of something unseen, something waiting in the shadows of the wind. And then he saw them, hidden in the tangle of brush, half submerged in mud. Two figures writhed. One clutched her side, a red bloom spreading across pale fabric. The other shivered, head lolling against the twisted branches, every breath a shallow gasp. They were women and they were dying. The rancher's heart tightened. Years of solitude, of dusty chores and quiet failure, had not prepared him for this sudden, violent intrusion of mercy and terror. The storm tore at his coat as he crawled toward them, every lightning crack a drumbeat in his chest. He dragged one free, then the other, pulling them toward the safety of the barn's rickety walls, muscles screaming, lungs burning. Rain poured through gaps in the roof, soaking the hay and plastering his hair to his forehead. Yet inside, the storm felt different. Inside, there was urgency, purpose, a fragile tether to life he could not yet release. He tore strips of his own shirt to bind their wounds, feeling the warmth of their blood mingle with the cold rainwater on his fingers. Each heartbeat echoed like the thunder outside, a reminder that time was fleeting, and mercy demanded courage. The first part of the stormed morning passed in a blur of motion, mud, and desperation. Outside, the world was chaos. Inside, the rancher worked as though guided by some quiet, unseen hand, balancing life against death, hope against fear. He whispered fragments of prayers he did not know he believed in, murmured promises to strangers he had never met, and kept his hands steady even as the cold gnawed at them. Lightning flashed again, brief and blinding. In that moment, he saw the women not as strangers, but as living cries for justice in a world that often ignored the weak. And in their eyes, through the rain and pain, there was recognition. Not of him, but of the choice he had made. A choice that would define him. The barn smelled of wet hay and fear, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood and the earthy scent of mud. Outside, the storm raged with relentless insistence. Yet inside, the rancher moved with a calm urgency born of necessity. He worked quickly, binding torn flesh, checking for broken bones, murmuring words that were half instructions, half prayers, all carried on the rhythm of the wind pounding against the wooden walls. The women stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open, revealing pain and confusion, but also a flicker of trust. One tried to speak, a broken whisper caught between sobs and grit, and he shook his head gently, urging silence, understanding that words could wait, but life could not. His hands, rough and calloused from decades of labor, were precise now, steady as the pulse of determination that surged through him. Thunder rolled overhead, shaking the barn like a drumbeat of judgment, and lightning illuminated the scene in stark, fleeting brilliance. A man alone against a storm, two lives balanced in his hands. He moved between them, his mind racing. Who were they? Why here? Why now? Questions pressed against him, but the answers would come later. For now, there was only action, only the fragile tether of survival, he could weave between these women and the cruel sky outside. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Each second held the weight of mountains, each heartbeat a drum announcing the precarious dance between life and death. He whispered promises he didn't know he could keep, pledges to protect, to endure, to stand between them and whatever darkness had brought them to this place. The storm outside seemed almost purposeful, a testing ground for courage and compassion. And then, as the first pale streaks of dawn cut through the lingering clouds, the wind eased slightly, the thunder receding to distant rumbles, the rain softened to a drizzle. The rancher leaned back, shoulders trembling, chest heaving, feeling the first flicker of relief. The women were alive, fragile and battered, but alive. He allowed himself a single, quiet breath, knowing the storm had not yet passed, that life outside would demand more courage than even this night required. He stepped to the barn door, peering into the gray, mist-soaked morning. The land stretched out, slick and wild, and he felt the weight of choice pressing on him. To hide these women and their secret, or to act with honesty, risking everything. His gaze returned to them, their trust a mirror of the humanity he thought he had long buried under toil and solitude. The storm had passed for now. But the real storm, the one of decisions, consequences, and moral reckoning, was only beginning. Morning light bled weakly through the gaps in the barn walls, a pale gray washing over damp hay and splintered wood. Frost clung stubbornly to the edges of the beams, tiny crystals catching the light like scattered stars, indifferent to the suffering within. The air was cold but still, the storm now a whisper beyond the horizon, leaving behind the sharp scent of wet earth and a lingering tension that seemed to settle in the bones. The rancher worked in quiet rhythm, tending to the wounded women with hands that knew both care and pain. Every movement stirred memories, fragments of a life carved by hardship, betrayal, and relentless toil. He recalled the long hours under merciless sun, hands raw from labor, face weathered by wind and dust. Faces of those he had lost, kin and friends alike, floated unbidden before him. A daughter stolen by fever, a brother betrayed by greed, neighbors whose promises had crumbled like dry soil. He paused, fingers brushing a shallow cut on one woman's arm, and felt the echo of guilt tightening in his chest. He had survived when others had not, a witness to the merciless march of chance. That guilt, sharp and unyielding, had hardened him over the years, shaping him into the solitary figure now crouched over strangers' pain in a barn soaked with stormwater. Outside, crows cawed in distant trees, their wings slicing through the gray mist, reminding him of time's passage and the cold indifference of the world. He moved to fetch water, his boots crunching over frost-hardened mud, and thought of promises never kept, to the land, to family, to himself. Every creak of the barn, every groan of the timber, seemed to echo back those failures. Yet, as he returned to the women, the weight of the past pressed upon him alongside a strange, budding sense of purpose. He cleaned the wounds methodically, tying torn cloth with practiced precision, whispering words of encouragement he didn't fully feel. His voice, low and steady, carried both authority and fragility, a reflection of the life he had led. A life of survival, but never of surrender. Each glance at the women revealed more than injuries. It revealed resilience, the quiet defiance of those forced into impossible circumstances. And in their presence, the rancher recognized a spark he thought long extinguished in himself, the capacity to care, to act, to confront the ghosts of his own history without faltering. A gust rattled the barn door, shaking frost from the beams, and he glanced toward the horizon. The land stretched endlessly, a patchwork of mud, rock, and stubborn vegetation, indifferent to human struggle. Yet, in this frozen morning, amidst the smell of wet earth and blood, the rancher felt a fragile connection, to the women, to the land, to the years that had forged him. He was alone, yes, but not powerless. The weight of the past was heavy, but it was no longer a chain to bind him. It was a foundation upon which he could act, upon which he could protect, upon which he could find redemption not for himself alone, but for those who had been thrust into this storm, into this barn, into his care. He straightened slowly, eyes meeting the women's as they stirred in the hay. The silence between them carried 1,000 unspoken questions, but he offered only a nod and the faintest grim smile. It was enough. For now it had to be enough. The morning stretched thin, pale light filtering through frost-lined gaps, touching the rough boards with a cold, unforgiving clarity. The rancher moved between the women with quiet determination, his hands steady despite the ache in his joints and the lingering sting of old scars. Every motion stirred another memory, another weight of a life shaped by hardship, where every choice had its price and every failure left a mark deeper than any wound. One woman shivered beneath the damp cloth he'd wrapped around her shoulders, her breaths shallow and ragged. He knelt beside her, feeling the pulse of life beneath his fingers and the fragility of trust in her gaze. The other stirred, eyes flickering open, and for a moment, the world outside the barn vanished. There was only this fragile stillness, only this shared vulnerability, only the quiet acknowledgement that they were now bound together by circumstance and the rancher's choice. His mind drifted to the past. The winter when frost claimed his father, the years of endless work to keep the land from reclaiming itself, the betrayals of men he had called friends. Each memory was a stone in the sack he carried on his back, dragging him down even as he worked to lift others. Yet, in tending to these strangers, he felt a strange lifting, a tentative lightening. Compassion, he realized, was not weakness, but a choice that demanded courage far beyond mere survival. The frost on the beams caught the first hint of sun, scattering pale shards of light across the barn floor, reflecting in the rancher's eyes like shards of a long-forgotten hope. Outside, the mist hovered over the fields, curling around fence posts and skeletal trees, obscuring the world in uncertainty. Within the barn, he prepared food and warmed water, simple tasks that grounded him in the present, forcing him to act, to care, to reclaim a sense of purpose that had long been buried beneath guilt and solitude. He spoke softly, not to command but to reassure, to fill the silence that stretched between breaths and ragged moans. Words were unnecessary, yet they fell from his lips anyway, a rhythm that anchored him as much as it did them. He could not erase the past, could not undo the losses and betrayals, but he could act in this moment, and for now that was enough. As the women rested, the rancher stepped to the barn door and looked out over the mist-shrouded land. Every tree, every muddy furrow, every distant hill seemed charged with memory. He had walked this land alone for years, carrying the weight of failures and regrets, but now he realized that weight could serve him, could sharpen him, could drive him to protect life where he had once only protected property. A distant crow cried, slicing the silence, and he felt the truth of it in his chest. The past would always be with him, but it need not define him. His hands, stained and calloused, held the power to shape the present, to act with courage, to redeem not just himself, but perhaps others who had no choice but to trust in the mercy of a stranger. And as the frost began to melt under the weak sun, the rancher understood that the true test was not the storm he had survived, nor the wounds he had seen, but the choice to embrace hope in a world that had long denied him comfort. The mist hung low over the ranch, curling around fence posts and bare trees like a living thing, carrying the chill of early morning across the frost-slicked earth. The women rested on damp hay, their breathing shallow but steady, and the rancher moved between them with quiet vigilance, eyes scanning the horizon beyond the barn. The land lay muted, gray and heavy, yet beneath its silence there was a pulse, the faint, rhythmic beat of approaching life, deliberate and measured. A sudden movement caught his eye, dust swirling on the far trail, a lone figure cutting through the pale fog with the careful gait of a seasoned traveler. His hand instinctively went to the worn grip of his rifle, not in immediate fear, but in anticipation. For in these lands strangers rarely arrived without purpose, and purpose was often accompanied by peril. The figure drew nearer, a scout from the neighboring Apache tribe, boots crunching on frozen mud, bow slung over shoulder, eyes sharp and wary. The rancher felt tension coil tight in his chest. He had long known that the world outside his fields was filled with suspicion and ancient grievances, that a single misstep could turn neighbor into foe, curiosity into confrontation. Yet he had not anticipated the weight of this encounter, the quiet scrutiny that could measure intentions, truth, and lies before a single word passed between them. The scout paused at the edge of the barn, gaze sweeping the structure, the rancher, the women wrapped in cloth and shivering. His eyes were dark, unreadable, reflecting a history older than any building, older than any road. The silence stretched between them, a taut wire vibrating with possibility and danger. The rancher shifted slightly, the soles of his boots squelching in the mud, yet he did not retreat. He could feel the storm of judgment coming, not from the sky, but from the weight of tribal eyes trained on the unknown. He stepped forward, voice low but steady, carrying over the crunch of frost and the distant call of crows. Words were exchanged carefully, deliberate, a dance of language and gesture shaped by mutual wariness. The scout's expression did not soften, yet neither did it harden, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The rancher understood then that this moment could determine more than trust. It could define life, allegiance, and the fragile balance between survival and hostility. Behind the barn, the women stirred, sensing the arrival of someone whose presence brought both threat and the possibility of aid. The rancher's mind raced, parsing gestures, measuring intent, balancing caution with the pressing need to protect those in his care. Every second carried weight, every movement a signal. The land around them seemed to lean in, listening, waiting for the truth to reveal itself in body language, in tone, in the subtle currents of human interaction honed over lifetimes. And in that silence, beneath the gray mist and frost, the rancher felt the first tremor of understanding. The arrival of the stranger would demand honesty, courage, and a willingness to stand not only for the women before him but for the fragile moral compass he had spent a lifetime shaping. The storm outside had passed, but the storm of judgment, suspicion, and the potential for conflict was only just beginning. The scout's eyes lingered on the women, on their bruises and bandages, then returned to the rancher with a piercing intensity that seemed to weigh every heartbeat. The wind whispered through the skeletal trees, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and distant smoke, as if the land itself had paused to witness this fragile negotiation. Words came slowly, measured, a careful cadence between two worlds, the settlers' isolation and the Apache tribe's vigilance. The rancher's voice held steady, calm but resolute, explaining the storm, the discovery, the urgency that had driven him to risk life and property to save them. Each syllable was a bridge, a silent appeal to shared humanity, even as his hands tightened instinctively on the damp wood of the barn doorway. The scout listened, eyes never wavering, reading the truth not in what was said, but in posture, in hesitation, in the tremor of compassion that betrayed the rancher's long-suppressed empathy. A subtle nod passed between them, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the weight of acknowledgement. Trust would not come easily, but it had taken its first tentative step. Outside, the mist began to thin, revealing the rolling hills and muddy tracks carved by the storm, the land itself a quiet witness to the fragile truce forming in that barn. The women watched from the hay, their eyes wide, sensing the shift. They did not understand the language, but they felt the tension, the unspoken understanding that survival often required alliances forged in silence and courage. The rancher moved to shield them slightly, a small but deliberate gesture that spoke louder than any explanation could. His own moral code driving him to stand firm, to protect, to act as mediator between stranger and fate. Time stretched in the gray morning light, punctuated only by distant crows and the occasional gust that rattled the barn boards. And yet, in this tense calm, the rancher glimpsed possibility. That honesty and courage could bridge worlds, that empathy could temper suspicion, that a single act of moral integrity could ripple outward, reshaping outcomes beyond immediate comprehension. The scout finally stepped closer, lowering his bow slightly, a silent question in the tilt of his head. The rancher met it with steady eyes, unwavering, understanding that this moment was more than negotiation. It was a test of character, a trial not of strength, but of the courage to act rightly under scrutiny. The fog continued to lift, revealing the stark contours of the land, muddy and battered but alive. And in that quiet unveiling, the rancher realized that the choices he made in the next few breaths would not only determine the fate of these women, but the tenuous balance of trust and respect that hung between two worlds, fragile yet capable of endurance. As the first slivers of sunlight touched the frost-laden earth, the scout gave a subtle gesture, one that spoke of acknowledgement, caution, and the possibility of alliance. The rancher understood. The path forward would be fraught with uncertainty, but for the first time since the storm began, there was clarity and purpose, and a fragile hope that courage and honesty might yet prevail. The golden hour light spilled over the horizon, piercing the remnants of morning mist with sharp, amber fingers. The ranch, slick with rain and mud, seemed to hold its breath, the world momentarily still as if waiting for a decision that carried more weight than thunder or storm. The women lay quiet on the hay, their breathing steady but fragile, eyes closed, shadows of fear etched into every line of their faces. The rancher stood at the barn doorway, shoulders tense, chest heavy with the gravity of the choice before him. Beyond the fields, beyond the fence posts splintered by winter storms and human neglect, lay a world of suspicion, judgment, and the potential for violence. To hide the women was simple, silent, safe, a temporary reprieve from consequences. To reveal the truth was perilous, risking property, pride, and perhaps even life. But the weight of morality pressed down, relentless and unyielding, refusing to be ignored. He moved among the women, brushing damp hair from their faces, checking each bandage, each shallow breath. They had placed their trust in him, fragile as spider silk, and he could not abandon it. His hands, raw from toil, could save them, could bridge the divide between danger and sanctuary, but only if he acted without fear. He felt the past, the long years of solitude, the bitter taste of failures, rise up like smoke from old fires. This moment demanded courage greater than any he had shown before, a leap into the unknown armed only with integrity. Lightning flashed far on the horizon, briefly illuminating the scarred earth, and he stepped toward the women with a resolve sharpened by years of survival. The storm outside had ended, yet storms of conscience and consequence roared inside him. He whispered a single vow, one unbroken by fear. He would act rightly, no matter the cost. The rancher walked to the edge of the barn, eyes meeting the scouts across the muddy yard. Words came slowly, deliberate, a translation of intent and truth shaped by experience, respect, and courage. He told of the storm, of discovery, of the women's injuries, of the peril he had risked to bring them to safety. Every syllable carried honesty, stripped of embellishment, yet heavy with moral weight. The scout's eyes narrowed, scanning, measuring, weighing not just the words but the rhythm of movement, the tension in shoulders, the cadence of breath. Trust was fragile here, but the rancher's decision to act openly offered a bridge, a chance for understanding that could prevent conflict before it began. The land itself seemed to lean closer, the wind softening to a whisper, as if holding its breath to see what courage could yield. Inside the barn, the women stirred, sensing the delicate negotiation outside. They did not understand the language, but they felt the honesty, the protection, the resolve of a man willing to place morality above self-interest. The rancher's hands hovered near them, a silent pledge of guardianship, and in that simple gesture, a deeper truth emerged. Bravery was measured not in fists or firearms, but in the unwavering decision to stand for what was right. The scout finally nodded, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement and cautious respect, and the tension eased just enough for hope to take root. The women, still fragile, sensed it too, and a faint color returned to their cheeks. The rancher understood that this choice, this act of moral courage, had not only safeguarded lives but forged a bond, tenuous but real, between settler and tribe, between fear and trust. The golden sunlight grew warmer, spilling over mud-slick fields, highlighting the raw, wild beauty of the land. The storm had passed, the danger momentarily stilled, and in that quiet glow, the rancher allowed himself a single, steady breath. He had acted rightly, choosing integrity over convenience, humanity over fear. The choice had been made, and though challenges would follow, The path forward now held the faintest promise of hope, a fragile, luminous thread weaving through the aftermath of chaos. The sun climbed higher, scattering the last remnants of morning mist across the ranch, and the barn smelled of damp hay, sweat, and quiet anticipation. Dust clung to every surface, a thin veil over the scars of storms past and the present chaos of survival. The women lay on makeshift bedding, their breaths growing steadier, but their eyes, sharp and wary, betrayed stories untold. The rancher moved among them, inspecting each wound again, brushing aside the grime, and in the stillness of the barn, fragments of their story began to seep through. Small gestures, furtive glances, whispered names in a tongue foreign to him, all hinting at something larger, something that reached beyond the borders of his land and the storm that had just passed. He sensed tension beneath the surface, a careful dance of secrets wrapped in vulnerability and fear. Outside, the dust-laden sunlight stretched across furrows and fence posts, muted yet relentless, illuminating the rough outlines of the land like a silent witness to the unfolding drama. The rancher's mind raced, connecting fragments, observing details previously unnoticed. A torn emblem on a tattered sleeve, a stain on fabric too deliberate to be accidental, a shadow of hesitation that spoke louder than words. The women were not merely survivors of a storm. They carried with them the weight of something far more dangerous: betrayal, conflict, and the echo of violence that had crept closer than he ever imagined. Every sound, the creak of the barn, the distant crow, the whisper of wind through broken boards, seemed amplified, a pulse that mirrored the tightening knot in his chest. He realized that the danger was not only from the storm outside, nor merely from strangers on the horizon. There were truths buried beneath layers of dust and concealment, truths that could shatter the fragile peace he had fought to secure. And yet, in each carefully observed gesture, he found clues, subtle signs of trust, hints of allegiance, and the faintest glimmers of a story that demanded patience, intelligence, and courage to unravel. As afternoon sunlight slanted through the barn's gaps, illuminating the rough textures of wood and hay, the rancher pieced together more of the women's pasts. Each revelation arrived slowly, like dust drifting through shafts of light. A whispered name, a partially revealed map of alliances, a hint of the outlaw gang whose shadow stretched far wider than he could see. Their injuries were not random, he realized. They were a message, a warning, a call to action he could not ignore. He crouched near the women, hands steady, voice calm, probing gently for information, listening as much to pauses as to words. The air was thick with tension, yet beneath it pulsed a fragile hope. They spoke of land disputes, of betrayal within their own ranks, of a threat that had crossed boundaries and crept closer to his ranch than he had imagined. Every detail intensified the stakes, each revelation tightening the web of suspense that now wrapped around them all. Outside, muted sunlight caught the haze of dust and sweat, painting the barn in sepia tones, as if time itself had slowed to witness the careful unraveling of secrets. The rancher understood then that trust was a fragile commodity, more valuable than firearms or fences. To navigate this web, he needed patience, cunning, and a steady hand. For a single misstep could ignite vengeance that spread beyond the barn, beyond the fields, and into the surrounding plains. The women's eyes, bright despite fatigue, reflected both fear and a flicker of relief. In their presence, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than ever. He could not ignore the implications of their stories, nor could he allow his empathy to cloud judgment. The choices ahead required strategy as much as compassion, foresight as much as courage. Every heartbeat in the dusty barn echoed with the tension of secrets waiting to be fully revealed, of alliances and betrayals yet to be tested, and of the dangerous truth that lay just beyond the horizon. By evening, the rancher stepped outside, boots sinking slightly into the softened mud, eyes scanning the horizon where fields met hills. He felt the land itself holding its breath, as if aware that the next chapter of events would challenge loyalty, reveal hidden motives, and demand action beyond instinct. Beneath the settling dust, beneath the quiet murmur of wind and distant crows, the first threads of revelation had woven themselves, threads that would pull him inexorably into a storm of vengeance, justice, and moral reckoning. The horizon darkened once more, heavy clouds gathering like silent witnesses to the land's unrest. Mud-slicked hills glistened under the low, gray light, and the distant wail of wind carried the promise of violence. The rancher moved through the fields with deliberate caution, the women following, their steps faltering but resolute. The barn behind them smelled of smoke and damp hay, a fragile sanctuary now dwarfed by the threat encroaching from the edges of the plains. From the ridge, he saw them, figures moving with a precision born of malice, outlaws marked by past grudges, their intentions unmistakable. The rancher's jaw tightened. Years of solitude had taught him the language of danger. The way a shadow shifted, the faint metallic glint of rifles in the fading light, the disciplined march of men accustomed to fear and to inflicting it. He understood that tonight, survival would demand not only courage but cunning, not only strength but strategy. He ushered the women to cover, checking the weapons he had maintained with quiet pride for decades. Each rifle, each pistol, carried the memory of hard-fought battles, of long nights guarding land and livestock from those who would take without thought. He felt the moral weight pressing against him, the line between justice and vengeance, protection and bloodshed. Every choice could tip the scale, every hesitation could cost lives. The first attack came suddenly, like a jagged crack of thunder. Outlaws surged across the fields, shouting, guns raised. The rancher fired with precision, each shot a calculated assertion of survival, each movement a blend of instinct and experience. The women, frightened but determined, assisted where they could, their courage blooming amidst chaos. Firelight from distant cabins flickered against the clouds, reflecting in eyes wide with fear and resolve. Thunder rumbled overhead, mud and rain mixing beneath boots and hooves. The battle pressed in waves, each confrontation tighter, more dangerous. The rancher's mind raced, balancing defense and counterattack, survival and mercy, calculating every move while the storm outside mirrored the fury of the moment. In the tension, he felt something stir, a moral reckoning that went beyond life and death, reaching into honor, integrity, and the thin line separating vengeance from justice. Night had fallen, thick and oppressive, the storm above matching the turmoil on the ground. Lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating the chaos. Dust rising from overturned earth, rifles gleaming, shadows lunging across mud-slicked terrain. The rancher's heart pounded, every muscle coiled with tension. Yet his movements remained precise, deliberate, guided by the fierce rhythm of necessity. The outlaws pressed harder, seeking to overwhelm him, to exact revenge for past conflicts etched into memory and blood. But the rancher, alongside the women and a few tribal allies who had arrived silently, met each attack with calculated resistance. Their coordination was quiet but effective, a shared understanding born from desperation, courage, and the knowledge that hesitation meant death. Every shot fired carried not only force but moral weight. Every dodge, every command, a testament to the stakes of integrity under fire. Inside the barn, fires flickered, casting shadows across the walls, painting the space with urgency and terror. The women, once victims, now acted with resourcefulness, bolstering barricades, carrying water, tending to minor wounds, their courage blossoming in the crucible of conflict. The rancher watched them, pride tempered with worry, understanding that survival required not only strength but moral clarity, the ability to temper vengeance with mercy, even as rage pressed close to the surface. The storm's fury outside mirrored the battle within, rain lashing, wind tearing at roof boards, thunder booming as if the heavens themselves weighed in on human strife. Yet amidst the chaos, the rancher's mind remained a fortress of strategy, morality guiding every decision, ensuring that each act of force was measured, necessary, and just. Outlaws fell back, wounded or driven away, their anger met not with reckless fury, but with disciplined resolve. By the first hour of night, the tide had turned. The attackers, beaten but not entirely vanquished, retreated into the darkness, leaving the ranch scarred, soaked, and alive. The rancher stood in the rain, mud clinging to boots, chest heaving, hands shaking with adrenaline and fatigue. Around him, the women and allies caught their breath, eyes wide with relief and lingering fear. In that fleeting calm, the rancher realized the truth. Vengeance alone could not secure life, nor could rage alone protect those in his care. Only measured courage, strategic intelligence, and an unwavering moral compass could prevail in a world steeped in chaos. And tonight, against all odds, he had proven that principle. The blood-red sunset stretched across the plains, long shadows cutting sharp lines across the mud-slicked fields. Silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the skeletal trees. The rancher stood at the ridge, boots sinking slightly into the softened earth, eyes fixed on the distant figures approaching, the orchestrators of the women's suffering, drawn by vengeance, pride, and greed. Each step they took toward the ranch seemed deliberate, measured, echoing a world of past betrayals and unspoken grudges. The rancher's hand hovered near his rifle, not in panic, but in preparation. A calm, controlled readiness born of years navigating danger and moral complexity. Every sinew of his body knew what was coming. Every heartbeat mirrored the tension that stretched taut between justice and bloodshed. The women, now steady on their feet, moved cautiously behind him, their eyes sharp, muscles coiled like spring steel. They had survived storms, both literal and human, but the reckoning promised something different. Not random chaos, but intentional confrontation. Their attackers had a name, a purpose, and they would not hesitate. The rancher understood that this moment demanded not only courage, but moral clarity. He had to balance retribution with restraint, justice with mercy. The first shot rang out, distant but precise, slicing through the tension like a knife. The rancher returned fire, measured, calculated, every pull of the trigger carrying weight far beyond survival. Each movement was choreographed with instinct and moral purpose, to protect, to deter, to confront evil without becoming it. Shadows stretched long and menacing, the land itself seeming to pulse with the gravity of the encounter. Voices rose in the fading light, words carrying both threat and warning. The rancher's response was deliberate, grounded not in anger, but in a calm authority that commanded respect. Every exchange, every glance, every shot fired carried emotional and moral weight, a dialogue of courage and principle writ in mud, blood, and sweat. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the first act of reckoning concluded. Tension unresolved, but the balance of power shifting. Night fell quickly, the last glow of sunset swallowed by darkness, punctuated only by the distant flash of rifle fire and the glimmer of embers from smoldering fields. The rancher moved with a quiet urgency, guiding the women and a handful of allies into positions of advantage. Every step calculated, every breath a blend of anticipation and resolve. The outlaws pressed forward, their anger and greed colliding with the disciplined courage of those defending the ranch. The battle that unfolded was precise, brutal, and morally charged. Each encounter was more than a clash of firearms. It was a test of character, a measure of courage under the weight of consequence. The rancher did not act recklessly. Every movement balanced necessity with restraint. Every shot fired aimed to subdue rather than destroy. Every command given to protect life as well as property. The women, hardened by previous trials, now fought with a blend of fear and newfound courage. They aided where they could, acting as shields, messengers, and observers, their eyes reflecting both terror and determination. The storm of action was punctuated by moments of quiet insight, a glance between allies, the subtle shift of a body, a whisper of strategy, each moment shaping the tide of confrontation. The outlaws' resolve began to crumble as the rancher's tactical intelligence and moral clarity became evident. Their fury, once a roaring tide, was met with measured resistance, careful placement, and the unwavering authority of a man who understood the price of courage. Slowly, inexorably, the balance shifted. Retreat became the only choice for those driven by vengeance alone, leaving behind a scarred but intact land, and a rancher standing as the embodiment of honor and resilience. As the dust settled, the red glow of the battlefield lingered in the eyes of all who had survived. The rancher's chest heaved with exertion, yet his mind was clear, reflecting on the moral lessons of the night. That true courage is not measured by violence, but by the wisdom to wield power with justice, the restraint to temper anger with mercy, and the willingness to protect life even at great personal risk. Beneath the blood-red sky, with shadows stretching long across the plains, the rancher understood that this reckoning had not only settled a score, but had defined him in a way that no storm, no attack, and no betrayal ever could, as a man guided by integrity, strength, and unwavering moral clarity. The first rays of soft sunrise spilled across the plains, scattering gold and amber over dewy grass that clung to the earth like a promise of renewal. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed and quiet, every puddle reflecting the pale light with a crystalline clarity. The rancher walked slowly among the remnants of the previous night's battle, boots sinking into softened mud, eyes scanning for signs of threat, for evidence that danger still lingered. The attackers had vanished, leaving only traces of chaos. Splintered fence posts, scorched earth, and the faint, lingering odor of smoke. But there was also evidence of restraint, of mercy, and of a battle fought not for bloodlust, but for protection and moral duty. The women emerged from the barn, now fully alert, moving carefully across the field, their shadows stretching long in the new light. Gratitude and relief mingled in their eyes, tempered by the memory of fear, yet strengthened by the knowledge that they had survived, that justice had found them. Across the horizon, figures appeared. Neighboring settlers, cautious, curious, some skeptical, others relieved. Word of the night's events had traveled swiftly, carried on the wind, through whispers and rumor, and now the rancher's actions were beginning to ripple beyond the confines of his land. The Apache scout returned, silent but resolute, observing not with suspicion, but with a measure of respect and acknowledgement. Trust, hard-won and fragile, had taken root. The rancher's chest rose and fell with a slow rhythm, each breath a testament to endurance, to courage exercised under pressure, and to the moral choices that had guided him. Every broken fence, every mud-streaked field, every scarred tree told a story of vigilance and virtue. And in that quiet dawn, he understood the full measure of his actions. Justice was not always loud or immediate, but it could shine like the morning sun, gentle yet unwavering, revealing truth and courage across the land. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky with soft pinks and golds, the rancher moved among the survivors and allies, tending to minor wounds, repairing fences, and restoring a semblance of order. The women's steps grew steadier, their expressions brighter, reflecting both relief and the quiet triumph of survival. Gratitude, silent but profound, passed between them, unspoken yet resonant, a testament to the bonds forged in the crucible of crisis. Neighbors approached cautiously, their initial wariness giving way to respect. They spoke in muted tones, offering aid, acknowledging the rancher's decisive courage, and recognizing the restraint that had prevented further bloodshed. Even the Apache scout lingered nearby, a presence both silent and reassuring, bridging worlds once divided by fear and suspicion. In these moments, the rancher felt the fragile pulse of community, strengthened by moral action and tempered by endurance. The land itself seemed to exhale, the mud drying beneath the warmth of sunlight, the grass lifting in gentle sways, the distant hills bathed in a golden glow. The storm had ended not only in weather, but in human conflict. Justice had been served without chaos consuming more lives than necessary. The rancher paused, hand resting on a fence post, watching the interplay of light and shadow across the plains, sensing that the balance had shifted, that courage and moral clarity had forged a new order. In that quiet moment, he understood something profound. True heroism was not measured by the battles fought, but by the choices made when faced with impossible stakes. The attackers had been thwarted, yet the rancher's heart carried no triumph of cruelty, no celebration of blood, only the deep, enduring satisfaction that justice, tempered with mercy, had prevailed. The dawn of the new day was more than light on the land. It was a reflection of moral victory, a promise that even in harsh landscapes, honor, courage, and compassion could shape the course of lives. The afternoon sun spilled gently across the ranch, warm light painting the fields and the barn in soft amber. The chaos of storms and conflict had passed, leaving a silence that was both heavy and comforting. The women moved among the hay and the repaired fences, their steps careful but steady, a quiet reflection of renewed strength. The rancher watched them, shoulders slumping slightly with relief, yet his eyes remained vigilant, aware that healing, though begun, was delicate and ongoing. The air carried the scent of damp earth and faint smoke, remnants of the previous battles, mingling with the soft aroma of fresh hay. The rancher tended to minor wounds, carefully cleaning cuts, wrapping bandages and offering water. Each gesture was deliberate, a quiet act of service that carried more weight than words. The women, once victims of circumstance, now stood with the promise of agency, and in their eyes, he glimpsed the fragile dawn of trust and forgiveness. Neighbors, previously wary, approached cautiously, their movements hesitant but respectful. They brought supplies, offered help, and spoke of gratitude tinged with awe at the rancher's unwavering courage. The Apache scout lingered nearby, silent, eyes steady, bearing witness to the delicate interplay of reconciliation and healing. The rancher understood that redemption was not merely personal. It radiated outward, affecting those who had observed, survived, and learned from the events that had shaken the land. As the day deepened, the rancher paused by the edge of the fields, feeling the quiet pulse of life returning. The women gathered their strength, their voices soft but assured, sharing glimpses of hope for the future. Each conversation, each gesture, was a reminder that moral courage could heal more than physical wounds. It could restore faith, nurture trust, and build bridges where conflict had once reigned. The sun began its slow descent, casting long, warm shadows across the plains. The rancher moved among the scattered remnants of battle, broken fences, scorched earth, and footprints in drying mud, each telling its story, each a reminder of past trials. He spoke with former enemies now subdued, offering handshakes, shared labor, and words of reconciliation. His actions spoke louder than weapons ever could, teaching that redemption was rooted not in retaliation, but in compassion, integrity, and moral fortitude. The women helped where they could, tending to livestock, mending clothing, and speaking quietly with the neighboring settlers. Their laughter, soft and cautious, returned like a fragile song carried on the wind. They were no longer merely survivors. They were participants in rebuilding, in fostering trust, in shaping a future defined not by fear, but by the courage and virtue witnessed in the rancher's choices. The Apache scout watched from a distance, a silent guardian, acknowledging the delicate balance achieved. Mutual respect now bridged worlds that had once been divided by suspicion and history. The rancher understood that true redemption required patience, empathy, and consistent action, the slow weaving of moral clarity into the fabric of community life. As the river reflected the warm hues of afternoon light, the rancher paused, taking in the scene. The women tending to their tasks, the settlers quietly aiding where needed, the land itself recovering from storms both natural and human. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not from victory over others, but from the restoration of trust and the possibility of continued harmony. Redemption, he realized, was a living process, nurtured by choice, courage, and the willingness to act rightly even when unobserved. And as shadows lengthened across the fields, the rancher allowed himself a single unhurried breath, a moment of peace earned through moral clarity, patience, and unwavering compassion. The land, the people, and the hearts he had touched all carried the quiet resonance of healing, a promise that honor and integrity could outlast chaos and fear. Twilight draped the plains in hues of pink and purple, the horizon stretching endlessly, serene yet charged with memory. The rancher stood on the ridge, boots pressing into the cooling earth, eyes scanning the land that had borne witness to storms, bloodshed, and courage. The women, their injuries healed and their steps steady, prepared to depart, their eyes glistening with gratitude that needed no words. The tribe lingered behind them, silent nods and quiet tears carrying volumes of respect and acknowledgement. The wind whispered softly through the grasses, carrying the scent of dewy fields and distant firewood smoke. Every detail of the land, the bent fence posts, the flattened hay, the scarred earth, told the story of struggle, of choices made, of lives protected. The rancher's heart beat in rhythm with this quiet symphony, a steady pulse of reflection and moral clarity. He had acted not for glory, not for recognition, but for the principle that guided every decision. Courage tempered with integrity, action guided by honor. He watched as the women disappeared into the horizon, their silhouettes framed by the dying light. The tribe followed slowly, leaving behind silent gratitude, their presence a reminder that trust, once earned, rippled far beyond immediate gestures. The rancher felt the weight of all that had transpired settle into something permanent, a knowledge that the land, the people, and the choices he had made would carry forward, shaping lives long after the storm had passed. Night approached softly, stars beginning to pierce the violet sky, the prairie winds calm and contemplative. The rancher remained on the ridge, alone but not lonely, reflecting on the journey of storms, conflict, revelation, and redemption. The land beneath him was quiet, yet alive with memory, of fear faced, of courage tested, of moral choices etched into every footprint and shadow. He understood now that heroism was not defined by action alone, but by the courage to act rightly, the wisdom to temper strength with mercy, and the willingness to bear the consequences of those choices. Every life spared, every trust earned, every act of compassion had formed a ripple, reaching across people, tribes, and settlements, reshaping the moral fabric of the land. The rancher inhaled the cool night air, letting the silence fill him with clarity. He knew that his deeds would not vanish with the fading light. They were etched into the horizon, carried in the hearts of the women, the tribe, and all who had witnessed courage in its quiet, unwavering form. Honor, he realized, is a legacy, not a moment. Courage is not in the absence of fear, but in action despite it. As the last glow of sunset surrendered to night, he whispered a thought carried on the wind, one destined to linger long after his presence. Some debts are paid not with blood, but with the courage to face the dawn. The prairie was silent, vast, and eternal, yet alive with the imprint of choice, the resonance of moral clarity, and the enduring power of integrity.